for joining the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast with your host, Clayton Craddock.
Born and raised in Queens, New York, Michael Keller is a graduate of the Manhattan School of Music. Upon graduation in 1971, he pursued a career as a professional performing musician spanning the next 35 years. Besides touring in the early 70s with Broadway National tours of Promises, Promises, Applause, and The Magic Show, Michael also worked with The Fifth Dimension and Dionne Warwick. Being hired as the original drummer for their Playing Our Song on Broadway led to the beginning of his long and rewarding working and personal relationship with Marvin Hamlisch. He embarked on a second related career as music coordinator beginning in 1992. Marvin Hamlisch gave him the responsibility to hire and coordinate the 63-piece orchestra for the Barbra Streisand concert tour in 1994. Michael repeated that effort several times over the next 15 to 20 years. Since 1993, Michael has been the contractor for Memphis the Musical, Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill, Hamilton, Dear Evan Hansen, The Book of Mormon, Wicked, The Lion King, and many, many more. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Keller. Welcome to Broadway Drumming 101. My guest today is Michael Keller. Thank you for being a part of this.
It's my pleasure, Clayton.
You joined Local 802, the Musicians Union in New York City, the year I was born.
1965, eh?
Oh, 1966, actually. Yeah, I was born.
Okay. All right.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were born in Queens and you were a native New Yorker. What made you decide to go into music?
Very simple. The Beatles.
Really?
Yeah, I was 14 in 1963 when they broke. Certainly when they broke here in the States, and that was the inspiration for a lot of people. And I took drum lessons, and two of my friends took guitar lessons, and another guy took bass lessons, and we eventually formed a band called, of all things, the Downbeats. And we used to play fraternity gigs and other things, and but that was the original inspiration. But for me, it became pretty serious pretty quickly, and the other guys, none of them pursued music, but within a short amount of time, I really started to shed, because I wanted to try to get into a music school, right? So I took lessons from a local guy where I lived, and he used to take lessons himself from this guy was legendary in the studio scene and in the legit scene. He was a percussionist named Morris Goldenberg, and he was in the Philharmonic. He was one of the percussionists. So I started taking percussion lessons with him because at that time, you could not attend like Manhattan School of Music or Juilliard or any of those programs as a drummer. You could only go through those schools as a percussion major. So I had to get my percussion chops together. So I did like a real crash kind of 18-month thing trying to get that together. And I actually got into the Manhattan School of Music. I applied to two schools. I applied to Manhattan School of Music and Queens College because I knew Queens had an excellent music school as well, right? So I got into both schools. Obviously, I chose to go to Manhattan. At the time, the guy I was studying with, Morris Goldenberg, was on staff, and then he had a contract dispute. He left, and so I wound up I was actually there 5 years because I was out of school for one semester. The percussion ensemble went on a cultural affairs tour of Europe, which was kind of interesting at 18 years old, So I was there for 5 years and graduated in 71. Okay. And the way I got started with shows, it's kind of a unique situation for me, at least, because my older brother was a musician, very active in the scene, did a lot of Broadway shows. And a friend of his was a drummer who was doing an off-Broadway show called Jacques Brel's Alive and Well, Living in Paris. It was down at the Village Gate, which at that time was on the corner of Bleecker and Thompson Street. It was basically like a jazz club. But we did this. There was this off-Broadway production of a show called Jacques Brel's Alive and Well, Living in Paris. Jacques Brel was a French composer, and he was having a lot of trouble getting subs because guys weren't available. I mean, or if he needed somebody and they weren't available at that time, whatever. So he hit on the idea that me being a student, I wouldn't have any conflicts. So I learned the show. I basically shedded the show and I learned it. And it was a combination chair. It was drums with some percussion. There was like quite a bit of marimba, mallets in it and some chimes and whatever. So anyway, I got it together and I was supposed to do a 3-week slot for him. And while he was away, he injured himself. I wound up doing the show for 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then he came back and then he left again and I did another 6 months. Meantime, I started doing some other off-Broadway shows. There was a show called, it was like a parody of the Shirley Temple movies. It was called Curly McDimple. So I started subbing on that show and then eventually took over the chair. Meanwhile, I was in school, so I was still going through the program. And then I got a great opportunity to sub on Promises, Promises, which was a Burt Bacharach, Hal David show that opened, I think, in 1968. I started subbing on the show in 1970. It was my first Broadway experience. It's a funny thing. The first time I looked at the book, the drummer was Alphonse Mouzon.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The original drummer was Bobby Thomas, who left and Alphonse took over. And then when Alphonse left, a guy named Buddy Neely took over the chair. And that's who I subbed for. I used to sub for Buddy. And I graduated in 71. And that fall, I went out with the second national tour of Promises, Promises. And so I spent the next couple of years basically being on the road doing shows. I did Promises, Promises. I did Applause. I did the Magic Show. So, that was kind of, I got involved very young. I was in 1968 when I started subbing on Jacques Brel. I was 19 years old.
So you said that the Ed Sullivan Beatles show was the catalyst that propelled you into wanting to be a musician.
Correct.
Did you want to be a rock star like that and be in a band like that? And you wound up doing the Broadway thing for, as far as I know right now, starting in 68 through where we left off in 1971 or so. Did you want to be in a big rock band, or did you just say, I just want to play music wherever I can?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think everyone, most musicians aspired to something, like that, either being in a rock band or a jazz band, fusion, whatever. I mean, because I listened to all of that stuff, all that music. I mean, there was a lot of great late 60s music. There were quite a few bands, obviously Blood, Sweat and Tears. There was another band called 10 Wheel Drive. They were like big ensembles, Elephant's Memory. I mean, they were big bands with horn sections and whatever. So yeah, that was always something that I wanted to do, but you have to live, right? So when the opportunities came along to play shows or whatever, I was ready, willing, and able to do it. And the thing is, when I came out of Manhattan, having to go through the school as a percussion major, and all of the percussion ensemble playing that I did, I came out of school. I mean, I was just completely and totally prepared. I mean, it was like, my attitude was like, you got music, stick it on the stand, count it off, let's go. I mean, I had a really, in the 70s, that early 70s, I had a real high level of confidence. The thing is that, I played percussion seriously through college. I actually gave it a solo recital before I graduated, but I'd always wanted to just be a drummer. So I kind of let all of that stuff go and just started just playing drums and wanting to have gigs as a drummer. That was kind of like how I started. It's a funny thing, the path that everybody takes, you know what I mean? Look, when I came up in the late 60s, there was a ton of work going on, right? I mean, there was a very vibrant recording scene. The three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, all had staff orchestras. That was their gig. 5 days a week, they went to the studio, whatever studio it was, and that was their gig. They were an ABC staff musician, NBC staff musician. NBC at one time had an actual full symphony orchestra on staff. So, the late 60s, there was a ton of works and everybody wanted to be in the studios, right? The thing about Promises is that was one of the first shows that was kind of a crossover. A lot of the guys in that pit were actually well established in the recording scene, but because it was Hal David, Burt Bacharach, and whatever, it was like more of a pop thing. That was like one of the first shows that really tapped into that genre of player. And it obviously it became like the norm. Guys would be studio musicians, but also would want a Broadway show. You got to jump ahead now, Clayton, to 2022. Everybody wants a Broadway show because it's the best gig in town. Unless you're in the Philharmonic or the Met or whatever, having a Broadway show is the best gig in town. The recording scene is nearly non-existent at this point, So it was a whole different time. I survived the 70s, certainly because I lived in LA for about 2.5 years in the mid 70s. When I did that show, I mentioned the Magic Show, it wound up in LA, and the guitar player and I just decided to stay and live in LA. We're going to make our fortune in LA. That lasted about 2.5 years because LA is not my cup of tea. It's funny that I don't know if I would have stayed in LA, because what happened was I met my wife. We've been together now 45 years, but I met her and she was living in New York, and it kind of gave me an excuse to come back home, something that I've never regretted, because LA, the thing in LA just never really, I never grooved with the whole LA thing. I find the musicians here have always been much more, to use the word collegial. I mean, I've always found the musicians to be much more supportive of each other and straight ahead, straightforward. That's why I used that expression earlier. I mean, if a guy didn't want to be bothered with you, he'd just tell you to get lost, F off, where that's not what I found in LA. What I found in LA were guys would come across as being very friendly and very inclusive. And then, doors would be slammed in your face left and right. So I don't know what it's like now. You have to understand, it's almost 50 years since I lived in LA. So I don't know what it's like now. I don't know if things have changed. But the guys were very, very proprietary about their work accounts. So anyway, I found myself back in New York, and I literally survived the mid to late 70s doing cabaret. Because at that time, unlike today, singers used to get booked into these clubs for like a week at a time, sometimes 2 weeks. And I used to just go from, I'm just going to mention these clubs that were happening at the time. I used to go, I would do a week at Reno Sweeney's, and then I'd go do 2 weeks at the Grand Finale, and then I'd go do a week at the Blue Angel, then I'd go back to Reno Sweeney's for 2 weeks. So there was just all of this cabaret work, and people were booked, not for a single night, but for a week at a time, sometimes, like I said, multiple weeks. So I survived doing that.
And then, can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Did you have to bring your drums to these places?
Oh yeah. I was a sight in the 70s, man, because I was part of a studio with six of us, I think, altogether. We had a studio on 50th and 7th. The building doesn't exist anymore. It was torn down, but we had a 2-room studio, and it was set up. The front room was set up as a rehearsal space. So there was a drum kit and a Fender Rhodes piano and a couple of amps. And the back room was all basically storage, you know. So I was quite a picture at that time. You'd see me walking through the streets with my trap case with my bass drum and toms piled up on top, and I would just wheel it through the streets, man. Or at the time, you know, there were cabs called checker cabs, which were these huge cabs. You could just open the back door and throw your whole drum kit in the back. So I used to do that too. But times have changed, man. When I was, you know, that I was with Dionne Warwick, right? During that time that I lived in LA, I was with Dionne Warwick for about a year and a half.
Where'd you meet her?
I auditioned for the gig. Let me see, that was in 76. I thought I had, at one time I had told you that I was on an album called A Man and a Woman, Dionne Warwick and Isaac Hayes.
Oh, yeah, you did tell me about that.
That we did in Atlanta during that time period. But I was with her from 76 into 77. And there were no roadies. I used to lug my drums to the airport, check them onto the plane, take them off the plane, get a station wagon. That's how that gig was done, man. You know, so now it's a whole different thing now. But back in those days, there were no roadies. There were no guys setting up your drums. There was none of that. So,
So one other question about those cabaret gigs, you know, I sometimes when bands, well, when I was playing clubs in the 90s and 2000s, I'd get a certain amount, and they're probably getting the same amount now. Back in the mid 70s, were you getting paid per week or was it per show?
Yeah, it was, you know, if it was a week run at Reno Sweeney's, you know, maybe I'd get $200 for the week, you know, maybe. Okay. You know, look, I was the house drummer at Dangerfield's when Rodney Dangerfield had a club on First Avenue. Mm-hmm. And I was the house drummer there for a year. My salary, this is 1973 to 1974, right? So September to September of those 2 years. My salary for 6 nights a week before taxes was $150 a week. I'll tell you exactly, I used to take home $132 a week. So, you know, I had a ton of different experiences during the 70s, you know, but I playing shows was always there, you know, I was subbing on some shows. And then I got my own first show. The first show that I got that was mine from the beginning was a show called They're Playing Our Song. Marvin Hamlisch and Carol Bear Sager. And I was good friends with the conductor, and that's how I got the gig. And, you know, I did that. It ran for a couple of years. Then I went right into another thing called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. And that ran for a couple of years. And then the transition for me into contracting happened in the early 90s. I had reconnected with Marvin in the late 80s and started doing his concert work like 89, 90, something like that. And I eventually became not only his drummer, I also became his conductor. So I used to conduct and play drums for him. And I did that for 15 years. So during that time, I was still subbing on shows and whatever. Marvin was a big we were very, very close friends, and he was a really big supporter of mine. And when I told him I wanted to get into contracting, he was very instrumental in opening the doors. I mean, I'll never forget the first project he gave me was a 50-piece orchestra for a movie score.
Oh, wow.
It kind of flipped me out to that was my first experience. But the thing is, I never had any issue with rhythm players or even horn players, but I knew I was totally a fish out of water with string players, man. So, but I was smart. I hired one of the studio string guys as my concertmaster. I made him the leader on the gig, and I asked him to subcontract the string section.
I was about to ask you, how'd you make that happen? That's interesting.
Well, that's what I did, and that became my original basis for string players. So, and then of course that led to my doing The Goodbye Girl, which is the first show that I was the contractor on, but I also played the show. And then the big thing for me, the thing that really opened doors for me, was Marvin let me be the contractor for the Barbra Streisand tour in '94 when she came out of retirement, and she did that first tour in '94, and that was a 65-piece orchestra. And Marvin had enough confidence in me to let me do that, and that really kind of propelled me in my contracting career because it opened up a lot of doors. People that wouldn't take my phone calls would all of a sudden be willing to at least talk to me.
In the 70s, when you were playing shows, I understand that there was no 50% rule.
No.
So how would you take off, and how did that work?
Well, you took off totally at the discretion of the production, the contractor, and or the conductor. You'd have to clear it with the conductor, and then you'd have to clear it with the contractor. And I'll tell you a funny story about that. And at the time, I think we got, it was at least a week, but it might have been 2 weeks vacation, in a year. But other than that, you were totally at the mercy of the contractor. And the contractor who actually was the production contractor on They're Playing Our Song, the trombone player, I'm not going to mention names, but the trombone player took his vacation time to go do a music festival, a jazz festival, and it got extended. And he called up the contractor and said, "Can I get an extra week?" And the contractor said, "Either come back or you're fired."
Damn.
And he was fired.
Oh, man.
Well, yeah, it was a different animal. The whole subbing thing didn't really come into the contract until, I guess, early '80s, maybe mid '80s, when John Glazell was the president of 802. That's when 802 started to turn a corner in a lot of regards. Because when I first joined the union in the mid '60s and then all through the '70s, I mean, the guys who ran the union, Max Aarons and all those guys, they were not really very amenable to looking out for the players. So for the first couple of years of my contracting career, everything was pretty much related somehow to Marvin Hamlisch, right? But when those doors started to open, I started getting other things on my own. So like in '96, I think it was '96 that I did the revival of Charlie Brown. And I also did an Andrew Lloyd Webber tour with Sarah Brightman, contracted that. And then things, the next big thing for me was contracting Lion King. And that was in '97. We're coming up on our 25th anniversary this year. That also kind of gave me a certain level of respect and a reputation, so.
Were you still playing drums throughout all this stuff?
Yeah, well, like I said, starting around 89, 90, I was with Marvin, and he used to do, I don't know, I guess he used to do maybe 125 dates a year, maybe. I mean, most times we would be running out to do like a 3-day weekend with the Pittsburgh Symphony or the Dallas Symphony. So he used to do maybe 125 to 130 dates a year. So I was doing that. And like I said, I was playing drums and conducting for him. And that lasted for 15 years. And I was still subbing on shows. After the Goodbye Girl, I didn't have another show of my own, playing-wise, until Marvin insisted that I do a show called Imaginary Friends in 2004. I didn't want to do it, but he insisted, and I couldn't say no. But I stopped subbing like in the late 90s because I found that I was really good at the contracting thing. It was like sort of tapping into a skill set that I didn't realize I had. And so I just, I use the expression, I jumped into it with all 4 feet. I just completely committed to doing that. And so I stopped doing that kind of, I stopped playing basically. And I really haven't played professionally in, it's got to be 15 years or more now, And I told you the other day, I finally set up my tubs in my basement because I've gotten the itch to get back to, just seeing what's in there anymore,
When you were taking those drums around town in the 70s and in the 80s, what kind of drums did you use? And did you find a certain kind of drum or a certain either case or anything to be more durable than others?
I know that cases and stuff have really kind of progressed quite a bit, but I don't even know if they still do they still have the Tuxedo brand of drum?
Well,
covers?
I used to use those. I haven't.
Yeah. So I had a standard, a fiberglass, whatever that is, a trap case, on wheels. Mm-hmm. And I used to put one tom-tom in the bass drum because back then, I only had one head on the bass drum. So one tom-tom went in the bass drum, and then the other, like the floor tom, used to sit sideways on the bass drum in the case. So that's how I used to wheel it all over town. I had the kit that I sent you the picture of. That's the kit that I acquired that kit in the late 70s, like 78 maybe. And it's a 5-ply Slingerland, natural walnut finish. And that setup is what I always used, which is a 8, 10, 12, 14 with a 20-inch bass drum. And the mount, it was I don't even think they make it anymore. It was a Ludwig tri-mount. So I could put 3 toms, and you saw that setup in the picture. They're like sort of nestled together, 3 mounted on the bass drum and then a standalone floor tom. I know a lot of guys are really into the double floor toms. It's something I never got into, but snare drums. My favorite snare drum for a long time was from that same era. It was a Slingerland brass 6.5-inch snare drum. I also had a couple of vintage drums like 1930s or 40s Levy Ludwig 8-hole 5-inch snare drum that was fantastic. And both of those drums, let me see, when did I get into it? I think it might have been when I was doing the Goodbye Girl pre-Broadway in Chicago. I bought some calf heads. So both of those drums are still set up today with calf heads on them.
You said you were influenced by the Beatles, of course, Ringo Starr. Who were some other drummers that influenced you back in the 70s and 80s?
Well, of course, Tony Williams and Elvin Jones and Art Blakey. When I was working at the Village Gate in the late 60s, like I said, it was still a jazz club. And what would happen is on weekends during the fall and winter, they would have jazz on the weekends, and we had to completely break down the setup. We had to strike the stage. And then Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, there would be jazz acts down there. So I was always able to stay. So I saw all of those people live: Cannonball, Miles, Bill Evans, Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie. I used to just stay and watch those guys play. You know, that's when I first saw Tony Williams. I couldn't believe how a 20-year-old guy could play like that, man. Anyway, and then, you know, during the summer, they had jazz every night. So we had to break down the set I had to break down the drum, the whole setup every night, because they had jazz in there. You know, Gary Burton, I used to see Gary Burton. It was a phenomenal experience. And then, in the early 70s, the first time I heard Steve Gadd, it was like one of those moments where it's like, wow, I'm never going to play like that guy. So there's a choice to be made. I'm either going to let him inspire me so that I can aspire to something, or I'm just going to burn my drumsticks and go do something else. Because to me, Gadd to me is my all-time favorite. And yes, there are a lot of great drummers, man. Buddy Rich, Louis Bellson, even going back before that, Gene Krupa. I mean, there's a lot of great drummers today. But, for me, Gadd has always been the number one guy, So I chose to let him inspire me instead of giving up.
Speaking of the number one guy, when I got into the business of Broadway with Memphis, I just remember your name being thrown around as the number one guy. When you were coming up and you were getting into contracting, who was the number one guy or girl, woman, man, during your formative years learning the contracting business?
Well, I mean, obviously the main guys through my early career, when I was a player, and then when I started to compete with them as a contractor, the main guys were, John Miller, Mel Rodman, Red Press. Those are the guys that did most of the work. And when I was coming up in the early 90s, I would say that John was probably the biggest contractor. It's different, now nobody mentored me. I learned how to do what I do or did on my own. And I made some errors along the way. There was a learning experience, a learning curve. Some people were surprised, 6-7 years ago when I decided to start to pull back a bit, that I would take on Mike Aarons as a full partner. But, I had no problem with that. I mean, I've given him every advantage I could. I've taught him everything that I know, and hopefully I've helped him avoid a lot of the mistakes I made early on. So, it was a little, I think probably a little different back then when I was coming up as a contractor. The other thing is, Clayton, I'd been around for a long time, and at that point I was in my mid 40s already, when I started contracting. And I had a couple of rubs with Mel Rodman, who, he passed, I guess it's got to be over 20 years ago. But Mel was like one of the big guys. I mean, he did a lot of stuff. He was a saxophone player. And I knew him basically through my brother, because my brother was also a redoubler. So they were friends. And but I learned how to do what I do on my own. And I'm not saying that I didn't have, I had full support of Marvin Hamlisch. And as the years went by, I think I established a pretty good relationship and reputation. I always prided myself on the fact that I was able to have a good rep with both the players and management. I'm sure there are guys out there who think I did them wrong or in some way, and they're not big fans. And I think that just goes with the territory. But I think for the most part, most musicians enjoyed working for me. I think most musicians were happy to get a call from me to do a show. And I had great relationships with producers and general managers. And look, I've had a very blessed career as a contractor. I became far more successful than I could have ever imagined going into it, And I think it's just a proof of what I brought to the table, the way I approached my work. And, the thing is with I pride myself that I gave Sean McDaniel his first Broadway show. I mean, he was subbing, I think, on 11 shows. He didn't have his own gig. And I hired him to do Spamalot in 2005, I think. So, look, I've opened the door for a lot of people, a lot of players. And what I say to young people who want to break into the scene, because that's what, like we talked earlier, everybody wants a Broadway show, right? It's the best gig in town now. In my day, and it's probably somewhat true now, a lot more guys did what I did, which is you went on the road for a couple of years. I did 3 or 4 show tours, and then you kind of make a transition. A guy who's like that is who's been very successful on Broadway is Gary Seligson. Gary was on the road for a number of years with different tours and whatever, and eventually established himself. So the thing is that you either do it that way or you get lucky enough to connect with players and become a sub. Because I can't tell you, the number is pretty high of the people who I met or became aware of because they subbed on one of my shows. And they were good, they were successful, and it led to my hiring them the next time I had an opportunity for their instrument. So that's kind of how it happens. You have to cut your teeth, you have to make your bones, as it were, subbing. It's very unlikely. I'm not saying it's never happened. I'm sure it has, but it's very unlikely that somebody's going to come into town and just get a show.
Well, people that are listening or watching this, they're going to be like, so you talk about doing a tour. How do I go about getting a tour?
If you like what you hear on the show, subscribe to the Broadway Drumming 101 newsletter at broadwaydrumming101.substack.com. That's Substack, substack.com. The Broadway Drumming 101 newsletter is your one-stop shop for everything you'll need to know about playing drums for Broadway musicals. When you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll learn about what it takes to be a successful pit musician with content delivered directly to your email inbox 2 to 3 times a week. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you'll have a backstage pass to the world of a Broadway drummer playing on a hit show. As a paying subscriber, you'll receive behind-the-scenes access to the life of a musician who makes a living on Broadway. You'll also be able to read every post, not just those occasional free ones, You'll get access to all newsletter issues in the archives and have an ability to participate in subscriber-only comments and events. If you become a founding member for a gift of only $75, you'll receive discounted private drum lessons and a 25% discount on future promotional products. If you'd like to make a direct contribution to the production of this show, you can reach us at Venmo at Clayton-Craddock, Cash App at Syncopated, that's CINCOPATED, or PayPal at Clayton Craddock. Any amount of support will be appreciated. Thank you for listening.
Well, people that are listening or watching this, they're going to be like, so you talking about doing a tour. How do I go about getting a tour?
You let guys like me and Mike Aarons and John Miller know that you're willing to go on a tour. You know, now there's all these websites now. Clayton, there's Muse and there's Maestra. And, you know, Mike Aarons has he's created a pretty extensive website where musicians can register on, he calls it our website. It's called M Squared Music. And people can register on the website and, you know, gives us an opportunity to vet some people to listen and whatever. So yeah, if you're willing to, Mike and I are always looking for people that are good players who are willing to tour, because, you know, I mean, I myself, without Mike, I have the Lion King tour, the Wicked tour, and then together with Mike, we have 4 Hamilton companies, Dear Evan Hansen, and Pretty Woman, right? So, and I replaced a keyboard player 2 months ago on the Wicked tour, and I'm currently in the process of trying to find a suitable replacement on the Lion King tour. So, you know, if people are willing to tour, they got to let guys like me and Mike Aarons and John Miller and Howie Joins, they have to let them know that, you know, and that is certainly a path to, you know, to getting established as a good player. And then at some point you want to come to New York and you want to, you know, the opportunity though is, you know, you got to think about altogether on Broadway, there's what? Even if you count in subs, there are maybe what? 400 or 500 people that make a living on Broadway? Musicians, I'm talking about. So that's a pretty small, you know, group of people in a very large union, right? So, you know, it's a hard nut to crack, but if you've got the goods, Clayton, it works out, man. You know, if you can play, it works out.
How does somebody, you know, we talked about the touring aspect. Somebody comes to town and says, you know, I want to sub. I want to be like Sean McDaniel. I want to sub on a bunch of shows. How do I go about doing that?
Well, that's the key to that. And I say this all the time to people who contact me who are new to town. You've got to be very persistent because, you know, you're aware that 802 publishes they have a website that lists all the Broadway shows and all the personnel, right? So you have to go on that website. You have to find the people that play your instrument, right? And you gotta get in touch. And you know, even to the point of like saying, look, I know you may not need a sub, but can I come and sit and watch what you do? And you just have to be very persistent, and you just have to really approach it from that perspective. You know, if you get an opportunity to go and sit, great. You know, you never know when somebody's going to be up against needing a sub, right? And the other thing is, you don't ever say no when if work comes your way via that path. Let's say you're sitting in a pit with somebody, right? And you're watching their show. And at some point that player might get called for a gig or might know of a gig that he can't do. And hey, but there was that young guy who sat with me. Let me see if he wants. So that happens too. And, you know, you have to be open to that, and you have to be willing to do those gigs, to do the gigs. You have to be willing to pay that price, because the only way you're going to get anywhere is that you have to be heard. You have to be heard. I mean, you could have I can't tell you how many fantastic resumes I've seen in my lifetime, but the execution on the other side hasn't been what it needs to be. So, you know, you can look at somebody on paper and say, wow, this guy looks great. But then you get a chance to hear him and it's like, doesn't really match the depth of the resume, you know. So you have to find opportunities to be heard. You have to be heard.
It kind of ties into the question I was going to ask. If I had a show, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears musical, and I'm a producer and I have $25 million to put into it, I want you to assemble a band. I want a great drummer to be a part of this show. How do you go about picking that particular drummer for that show?
Good question. I mean, I'd have to think about the drummers that I know, right? I'd have to think about the guys that I've had good experience with, like you, like Buddy Williams, like Sean McDaniel, like Gary Seligson, like Sammy Merendino. And then, of course, you know, there's my old crew of guys that I love to death. Guys like Warren Oates, Ray Marchica, Steve Bartosik, Clint Gannon, you know. I mean, there's a vast array of you guys that are all capable. And for me, being a drummer, I'm always looking for the drum bass connection. I want those two chairs to be meshed up. I mean, I think about, for instance, Sammy Merendino on Kinky Boots. We had Mike Viseglia on bass. I mean, they just killed it together. Killed it, you know. So for me, that's I'm not just looking in that scenario that you painted. I'm not looking just for the drummer or what I might think is the right drummer. I'm looking for the right drummer bass connection. I'm looking for that, for those two guys. And then, you know, I might even start to consider, where does the guitar player fit into that little rhythm section, you know? So I've known a lot of great guys. I mean, you know, keyboard players. Do you know Ted Baker? He was the original lead keyboard player on Lion King. He also worked with Steely Dan. You know, Ted's just a monster player. He's, you know, he's like somebody like Joe Joubert. I mean, Joubert is like off the charts. I mean, there is nothing Joubert can't do.
I know, he's great.
Joubert is off the charts, man. He's just, I mean, for me, there's nobody like Joseph, because he can do everything. He can sit down and play you a sonata, or he can you know, rock out, or he can do an R&B thing, whatever. It doesn't matter. Joseph can do it all. I've always been a big fan. That was a great experience for me. When I met Joseph on, I guess it was the late 90s, early 2000s. There was a thing called Three Mo Tenors. Do you remember that?
I've heard the name.
Yeah. It was like, you know, there was for a period of time, there were like these three opera singers, Placido Domingo, whatever. And they used to go around doing arias. So there was another version of that called Three Mo Tenors, which was, I can't remember I can't remember the three guys that did it. But anyway, it was like a big, you know, full-size orchestra, string section, whatever. And I did that. That was where I met Joseph, because he was like the supervisor guy. And we did a bunch of concerts at the Hammerstein Ballroom, and we did a bunch of concerts there. So that's where I met Joseph.
Let's go back to the Lion King. You got the Lion King, and that catapulted you into a different, I guess, level of awareness for everyone on Broadway.
Yeah.
That led you to other contracting opportunities. And did you feel overwhelmed with that at first?
No, people have asked me that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times Mike Aarons has said to me, "How did you do this by yourself?" But it's just like I said earlier. I just totally embraced it. I realized that I did it well, and I wanted to do it, and I enjoyed doing it. And I mean, there were years in the early 2000s where I was juggling like 3, 4, maybe even 5 shows in the same season. There were a number of times when multiple shows that I was connected to were vying against each other for the Tony Award. The most famous one is in 2003. I contracted Avenue Q, and they beat out Wicked for Best Musical, and they were both my shows. So, I don't know. It's just something it just was a right fit for me. I could handle it. And there were years when I had multiple things going on, multiple shows. And then, then the shows that I had that were successful started to spawn tours, which is another whole animal, because you have to find a whole other level of player. You have to find guys that are, first of all, you have to find guys that are either established and what they want to do is tour, right? So that's why I know players all over the country. They're not interested in coming to New York. They live in Florida and they want to do a tour, So that's a whole different approach. That's a whole different level of musician, because you have to find either young guys, like that's how I met Giancarlo D'Atrizio, is that his name? Yeah, Giancarlo. He did the original tour of Book of Mormon. So that's how I met him. So you have to find guys that are young and talented and looking to make a mark and go on the road. Then there's a whole other strata of player that is established in tour world, that you can tap into. But it's that was a whole different experience for me, putting a tour together, because it requires a bit of work. And I've said this to people, and it may sound strange, but in my years of contracting tours, sending tours out, I'd have to say that easily it's 50%. It might even be much higher. It might be as much as 60 to 75% of players that I've hired to do tours that I've never met.
Wow.
Because they were either like replacements on a tour that was up and running, because I would only be around a tour when it was first put together, right? There was an original group of people, right? But as I had to start filtering in replacements as a tour runs and people leave, many times I just relied on gut instinct to hire the right person. Now, I'm not going to represent that I was 100% right. There was some errors in judgment along the way, but you're kind of locked into a thing where you have to vet people as best you can, either through other people that they've worked for, right, or tours that they've done, so that you can get a feel for whether or not this is the right fit for your tour. So, the thing with Lion King led very soon after to Aida, which I contracted. And that's actually, I think that's where I met Gary Seligson.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was the original drummer with Jim Abbott on keyboard. And I had John Harrington on one of the guitar chairs in that show. And John used to agree to do Broadway shows for me occasionally. That was a long time ago. Also, Ted Nash. I don't know if you know Ted, the saxophone player. He's with the Lincoln Center Jazz Band, and he's an artist in his own right. And he did a bunch of shows for me too. But yeah, I met, you know who Randy Cohn is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the programmer.
Mm-hmm.
Randy was my assistant conductor on the Aida tour. Randy Landau, the bass player, was the original bass player on that tour, along with I think Bobby Baxmeyer did that also. Bobby. That's another move that happened for me in the late 90s. Tim Weil, who was the original music director on Rent, they had 2 tours out, and Tim had become like sort of aware of who I was and what I did, and he brought me into Rent to manage, from a contracting perspective, the 2 tours, because they had 2 tours out. So that was also a major thing for me, because I mean, there were some great players on those tours. I mean, Randy Landau was on one of those tours. Alan Childs, the drummer. Do you know Alan, the drummer?
Mm-hmm.
Alan's, what an amazing drummer he is, man.
Yes, he is.
He's like Sammy Merendino. In that genre, man, they produce a sound from the drums that it's just hard to describe, or also hard to duplicate.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of reminds me of do you know the drummer who Jeff Porcaro?
Mm-hmm.
He was with Boz Scaggs, and died at a very early age. But I mean those and Kenny Brescia. Kenny actually did. I knew Kenny because he did the Broadway production. It was that was quite an experience, because a couple of times we had to mount a resident company of Rent in San Francisco, and so I had to vet all of these local players in San Francisco. But that's where I met, and he's been doing shows for me for 20 years now. Do you know the drummer John Nader?
Mm-mm.
He was based in San Francisco, and he moved to LA. Mike and I put him on because of me. I've known John, like I said, for 20 years. He's done he did Lion King for me in San Francisco. He did Legally Blonde for me in San Francisco. He did Wicked for me in San Francisco, So he did Hamilton in San Francisco. And then he asked if we would put him on the LA company, because he wanted to check out LA. He wanted to move to LA and just check out the scene. So he's done both versions of Hamilton in LA, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic.
I want to just address something that a lot of people might not know. So there are the producers, there's the contractor, there's the in-house contractor, and there's the musicians. Could you share exactly, because I know that Mike Ahrens was the in-house contractor at Memphis, and then when he left, he put me on to be the in-house contractor. And I got a little taste of how that worked, and I worked with you and worked with the house manager of the Schuberts. For people that don't know, do you pick the in-house contractor?
Yeah, usually it's usually, and in most cases, it was always my choice. But it's always something that I did in consultation with the conductor, because I need to I need to have a very good relationship between the house contractor and the conductor, because they work very closely together. And I always view the house contractor, I mean, when I had shows, well, I still have shows, but I mean, I always view the house contractor as my, for lack of a better term, my lieutenant on site. So I need them to be in touch with me. I need to rely on them to keep me informed about what's happening. And the really good house contractors for me, Mike was like this, and I have a couple others. The really good house contractors know the balance of like what they should call me with and what they shouldn't. So it's a delicate balance, you know, because sometimes you have house contractors that call you about everything. And then there are others, I've had experience where there are others who don't call you enough, so that you're misinformed. And the worst thing as a contractor for me is to be blindsided by an issue, you know, to be called by the general manager or the company manager, or even in some cases, the producer, who will say, you know, like, this is happening. Why haven't you dealt with this? Or why aren't you aware of this? So, you know, it's a delicate thing. It's a balanced thing that has to exist between you and your people. So for the most part, I always had a house contractor in mind. You know, when I was putting a band together, I always had someone in mind, but I would never unilaterally just say, this is your house contractor. I would always discuss it with the conductor, because, you know, I view my position as being, I'm here to serve the conductor. I'm here to serve the production. I'm not the top of the food chain. I'm in the food chain, but I'm not the top of the food chain. In my estimation, the way Broadway has evolved. You know, back when I started, there were no music supervisors. I mean, there was a music director. You know, the conductor was the music director. And if a show was successful and went on the road, maybe that conductor would become the supervisor, right? Now, shows have a music supervisor right from the jump. I mean, there's a music supervisor right from the beginning. You know, back in the day, we didn't have that. It didn't exist. So, you know, you have to just collaborate with those people. You know, the other piece of this, Clayton, and I don't want to get too deep or far afield from what you want to talk about, but when I started contracting, I had a tremendous amount of autonomy. Okay, I mean, I would think about a show and what the style was and people that I thought were appropriate and whatever. That doesn't really exist anymore. It sort of has evolved, or it did evolve over like the last, I'd say 15 to 20 years, where the makeup of an orchestra band has become a collaborative effort on the part of the contractor, the conductor, the supervisor, and in some instances, the orchestrator, and if they're alive, the composer. Because I've done a lot of revivals as well, you know, where the composers are long gone. But if the composer is still alive, you know, a lot of them have opinions. And I'm not going to say that I haven't butted heads about personnel, but it's more of a committee, collaborative effort nowadays than it used to be. I kind of miss the autonomy that I used to have, you know, because I used to like to look at a band or an orchestra and say, with some pride, that's my band. They're not entirely my band anymore, you know.
Things that a drummer should never do in a Broadway pit.
That's a good one. You know, see, here's the thing that we haven't touched on yet. Clayton. Here's the thing about playing Broadway. The most fun on a Broadway show is creating the show, right? I mean, that's the most fun, right? Is when you're in the rehearsal studio and you're creating the show, right? There's all of that energy, all of that creative process. It's like as a drummer, you're creating your part, right? Then you get into the run. And see, this is where a lot of guys go wrong, because the thing about bringing a Broadway show is, the best way I've always been able to describe it is you have to realize, sitting in your chair 8 months into the run, the audience out there is seeing the show mostly for the first time. The majority of the people sitting in the audience that night are seeing the show for the first time. So they deserve to hear the show at its best, in its best form, right? So that's the trick, is to be creative. And then if you're lucky enough to get into a long run, maintaining that energy and that creativity, because once it's established, as a drummer, you can play different fills, right? Whatever. But it's realizing that once you create it, your job changes. Your job then becomes maintaining what you've created. And if you want to talk about things not to do, well, you can't go out, because you feel like you want to go take a left on something. You can't do it, right? Because you have to stay true to what you as the drummer have created. I always characterize, like, what am I looking for in a player? I want a great player who can get along with people. Because I made a lot of mistakes early, thinking that, well, all I need is a great player. But they weren't such great human beings. So there was a lot of rub, okay? So those are my two criteria. I don't care about anything else. Can you play your acts, and can you get along with people? If you can do those two things, and you understand what a long run show demands of you, then you're going to be successful. Look, you can't screw around with the music, right? I mean, once it's up and running, just because you're feeling that you want to, you need to be, you need to have more freedom. Sorry, doesn't work that way. You have a responsibility. If you have a chair on Broadway, you have a responsibility to deliver that chair, the music of that chair, with consistency. So, I can't really think of too many don'ts for a drummer on Broadway, as long as they understand that concept. As long as they understand that once they've been through the creative process, their responsibility becomes maintenance. So, and it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy playing the same thing 8 times a week. I had a ball. Whenever I had a show, I had a ball, because that to me in and of itself was a challenge. Can I keep it fresh every night? Can I deliver the best possible show that I'm capable of, taking into account that the people listening to me that night are hearing me and the show for the first time? So it's a some guys get that, some guys don't, but I don't think it's really in this age that we live in now, I don't think it's too much of an issue. I mean, there's some really great drummers, man. I mean, there are guys that I saw that you had a recent podcast with Jared Schoenig, man.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Great player, man.
One of my favorites.
Yeah.
Speaking of favorites, I got 3 more questions for you.
3? Okay, go.
your the show that you had the most fun playing on as a drummer, and the show that you just found in general to be your favorite overall musical of all time, or is it a play?
Well, that's.
And the last question has nothing to do with Broadway.
Yeah. Well, I got to think about that because obviously they're playing our song always has a special place in my heart because it was my first show that was mine and I created the book, so that's always had a special place for me. But in an equal way, the first Broadway show I ever played, Promises, Promises, has always been one of my favorites. I loved playing that show. I loved playing Chorus Line. I didn't play it a lot. As a matter of fact, I tell people this, and it kind of goes back to what I said to you earlier when I came out of Manhattan and started in the early 70s. I just was like brimming with confidence, I met my wife in San Francisco. She was doing the show Chorus Line in San Francisco. And I was going through San Francisco with the Fifth Dimension. I was with them for a while. So the conductor of that company of Chorus Line was a friend of mine. And I went to say hello, introduced me to my wife. And he said, "Hey, you want to play the show?" I'd never seen it. He said, "You want to play the show?" I said, "Yeah, why not?" So I sat in the pit on a Tuesday night. The drummer was a guy named Dorian McGee.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, I don't know him, but I know who he is.
Yeah, so he was the drummer. So I sat in the pit on a Tuesday night, watched him play the show, and I played the Wednesday matinee. Yeah, and I have a tape to prove it. So anyway, the thing is, what I mean by that is that you can't do that now with what a Broadway drum book has become with the Ableton and the electronics and you can't do that, right? So, but anyway, so I enjoyed playing that show. Obviously, I enjoyed Goodbye Girl because I created that one too. That was mine. But I would say that Promises always has a very, very special place in my heart because I loved playing that show and I was on tour for 10 months with it. So, well, my favorite show of all time. There's a lot of shows, man. I've been fortunate enough to be connected to a lot of shows, and I can't. Of the shows that I have that are currently running, I really can't. Can't really pick one over another because they've all been great to me. I will say that like a lot of people, I was completely blown away by Hamilton. And then there was a show in the early 2000s that I contracted. I didn't play it. Mike Aarons was on it. That I contracted. That musically has always been a favorite of mine. It was called Next to Normal, and it had a relatively short run on Broadway, but musically and what the story has just always been a favorite of mine, and it's been probably close to 20 years since I contracted that show. It started off Broadway at Second Stage, and then it moved to Broadway, and the original drummer was Damian Bassman, and Mike Aarons was in the band, and so yeah. Look, there was a show Mike and I did a couple of years ago that wasn't successful. Honeymoon in Vegas, that Jason Robert Brown wrote, and we put together a smoking band, man. Jimmy Samplino was on piano, and the guy who was the original drummer on Dear Evan Hansen, Jamie. It's going to kill me that I can't remember his last name, but he was a great drummer, man. So,
Eblin?
Yeah, Jamie Olivor, right. So I've enjoyed a lot of, I had a good time doing a lot of the revivals that I did. It was fantastic to experience shows like Man of La Mancha, Fiddler on the Roof, Gypsy, to experience those revivals, because of what they meant originally, so yeah, I've got a lot of favorites, man. At the end of the day, I guess you could just say that my sensibility has always been very, very much in Broadway theater,
Final question I have for you. Tiger Woods' average scoring is 68.17.
Right.
Is yours higher or lower than his?
Oh, much higher. Last season, last golf season, so the golf season of 2021, my average score was 85.7. I don't know if you know much about the golf handicap system.
No, I don't. I've always heard about it. I don't know exactly what it is.
Well, there's after you've played, I think it's 10 rounds now. It used to be 20, but after you play a certain number of rounds, you are assigned an index, okay? And that index is used at every golf club that you play at to establish what your handicap is for that golf course, okay? So for instance, my current index is 9.1. So when I play my golf course where I belong, I'm a 10. But on a different golf course that might be deemed to be more difficult, my 9.1 index might translate into a 12 handicap.
So that means that it's above the 72? Like you were...
Well, what it means is that in a perfect world, if I'm playing a golf course where I'm a 12 handicap, right? Mm-hmm. The index establishes that I'm a 12 handicap. What that means is that in a perfect world, I should shoot 84. Mm-hmm. Because minus the 12, mm-hmm. I'd be at 72, which would be the, par, right? So the whole thing about a handicap is it allows players of different abilities to play and sort of have an even playing field. I play with a friend of mine, a close friend of mine that I play with all the time. He's a 5, and I'm a 10. So when we play at our course together, he has to give me 5 strokes. Now, what that means is that on the top 5, on every golf course, each hole is rated from 1 to 18, right? So like the number 7 hole might be the number 1 handicap because of its difficulty, right? And the 12th hole might be the second, whatever. So if he's giving me 5 strokes, that means on the top 5 holes on that golf course, I'm getting a stroke from him, which means that if I have a par and he has a par, I win the hole because I have a stroke and it gives me a net.
Oh, I gotcha. Wow. But do you get more strokes on that difficult hole?
No, you get
same amount of strokes.
It gets a little complicated. There are guys who have much higher handicaps, like they might be a 22, right? Which means that on an 18-hole golf course, there are 4 holes that they're getting 2 strokes. Okay. So that they can get down to the 18, whatever, so yeah, it gets a little complicated, but the game itself, and I said this to you the other day when we were talking on the phone, that for me, all of the time, energy, and commitment that I used to have to playing drums, I've just transferred all of that to my golf game. So, and sometimes sometimes the results are good and sometimes they're not. It's like when you're playing drums. There are some days where you can just, it just flows, right? The biorhythms all line up and it just, same thing happens on the golf course. Some days it just, yeah.
I think this summer I'm going to try it.
Yeah. Look, I've been lucky enough. I've in the last 5-6 years, I've broken 80, maybe 5 times. Shot wow. As low as 77. So yeah, it's a lifetime pursuit, man. It's just like playing. It's like playing an instrument, man. It's the same commitment. It's the same journey. It's the same. There are people that look at golf and they think it's an elitist kind of like, that's bull. Fine, that's fine. But I don't see it that way because I see it as because it's just you in that stupid little dimpled ball, man. Nobody's throwing it at you. Nobody's trying to steal it from you. It's just that little ball sitting on a tee and you have to hit it.
It's no offense, no defense, no.
That's right, man. You don't have a pitcher throwing a 98-mile-an-hour fastball on the inside part of the plate. It's like sitting right there, and you think it's easier to hit it, but it ain't. So.
Yeah, up where I live, there's Van Cortlandt Park, and I think
I played there.
They have some golf lessons up here, so
yeah.
I might see you. Maybe not this summer. Maybe next summer.
Well, when you feel that you're ready to venture out, man, you're always welcome to come and play my club with me.
All right.
You can be my guest.
I appreciate that, and thank you for being my guest here on Broadway Drumming 101.
Clayton, it was a pleasure to talk, and I hope I didn't expound to. I have a tendency to get going sometimes and just,
No, it was fascinating. I learned so much, and you're an encyclopedia of knowledge. So thank you, man.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and hopefully I look forward to how this is going to play with our brethren, our drumming brethren.
Yes, I'm sure they'll be interested in hearing your thoughts. And again, thank you. Man. Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you for listening to the Broadway Drumming 101 podcast. Head over to the Broadway Drumming 101 YouTube page where you'll find unedited conversations that I've had with some of your favorite musicians. On the YouTube page, you're going to find bonus content that I don't feature on my Instagram page or here on the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell at the top so that you'll be notified when a new video is uploaded. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for more.